been working with Stefan Bilbao for 12 years and with the NESS Project since its inception 4 years ago. I first heard these materials when I was a PhD student at the Sonic Arts Research Centre in Belfast. Stefan was a lecturer there, and one day he decided to showcase his materials in the Sonic Lab, and he asked me if I'd like to do a demo with the materials, and I said of course. In the early stages, it took so long to generate material that in fact I was working with samples that Stefan was generating. I subsequently went on to work on an 8-channel piece called Orbit. So I was working with non-linear plate models at the time, and again it was quite a laborious process in terms of computing power to generate plates. You would generally leave a model running, maybe overnight, maybe even over a weekend in some cases, and you'd come back and you'd have some sort of score at the end of it. One of the frustrations I remember at the time was that often the outputs from these materials would be very interesting just as they reached their limits of stability, and the model would explode essentially after that stage. Later, I came to work with the NESS team. This was in 2012. And I composed a composition called Ashes to Ashes. Now, one thing I knew that they'd been developing as part of the NESS project was brass models. And I was thinking of different sorts of sound worlds that I could draw upon, which would make use of both the percussive type models and the brass type models. And I began to think quite a lot about Tibetan ritual music. Now, one thing that's probably not at all obvious to you is that the composer has several tasks to do. One of these is to design an instrument. But the part that's quite unusual is then the composer has to learn how to play the instrument. I mean, the case in which I found this was most striking was in trying to get usable outputs from the brass models. The early outputs that you derive from these models, they're very much like the sort of sounds you might hear from a child's bedroom whenever they're learning to play a brass model, and indeed those were the kinds of outputs that I was getting. But after maybe several hours of working on it, I managed to get sounds more or less like the dongchen used in Tibetan ritual music. But I was searching around for something that might make the composition Ashes to Ashes a little bit different, and there were all kinds of parameters that one can use to define these instruments. And one of them turned out to be, in fact, metal type. And I started to think about interesting things that you could build instruments from. And one thing that struck me was, well, why can't we build a series of instruments out of uranium? Another feature of Ashes to Ashes is it's actually possible to derive outputs by driving one sound into a plate. And that's something that features towards the end of the composition. So I've been back in Edinburgh for the past week, and I'm now working on a 32-channel piece. The changes are quite astonishing from the early days. I mean, now it's possible to generate materials faster than real time. So what I can actually do is build an instrument and have a score, and I can make minor modifications, and I can actually hear these coming back at me pretty much straight away. And another feature is things don't explode anymore. So we can really experiment with what we're doing with these materials. I mean, looking ahead, I can see all kinds of interesting directions in which this project might develop. One of the things that could be developed are things in 3 dimensions. So you can imagine very dynamic 3-dimensional environments in which the listener is placed. Another thing that could be very exciting is the real-time potential of this, and how one might control the instrument. So to think way ahead, you could imagine that somebody could actually construct an instrument in real time using gestures alone, and then excite the instrument using gestures or something. So it's got all kinds of exciting possibilities.